This is very generous, but it raises also valid expectations. I think what we see as, I mean, I would agree that probably in a small country and with the amount of communication and collaboration we already have, the challenge of unification looks much more manageable than maybe in a big country. But what I think are key elements if we talk about wage setting is the question, coming back to the question of productivity and sharing the gains of productivity. I think we have to reject the argument that if you increase, that the only way to increase productivity is increasing the power of employers through labor market flexibility to break the collective bargaining system. That's basically the main argument which comes from the mainstream. I think we have a lot of evidence that wage setting systems actually can help to grow productivity, that they can create the form of competition which improves the rising productivity in the economy. However, I think in particular in small economies, you cannot just think if we have the right system of competition, automatically we get more investment and more productivity. I think that's one of the big challenges we have seen in the last years, that while profits have been increasing, they have not been reinvested in the economy. And that is, I think, where the state has to play a role in providing incentives that also what is made as profit goes back into investment into the economy. Looking at the hope that the unification will trigger a big investment boom in the country, I think that is key for the unions to try to have an influence what kind of investments you will get. I mean, there is certainly a risk, as I understand from the description, what might come here, that you get into another housing bubble with the unification process. There will be a lot of investment, there will be a lot of ideas that people can build things, that will give cheap credit again. And, I mean, so there might be a need right from the beginning to also the union thinking what kind of investment do we need. Final point, what I think is the unification process might be a moment to build institutions you think are useful. One is obviously a uniform institution about setting the minimum wage, be it sectoral, be it universal. Another thing is, I think what colleagues said, what are we doing if so many people have no rights, no access to rights? I mean, the one answer is always, okay, you organize them into unions, but we all know how difficult that is in small units and small enterprises. So there might be a need to think, can we create additional institutions which give workers access to rights and access to remedy? I mean, there are some examples that you could put a levy on wages which are then used by the unions or by another institution to provide legal advice and service to all workers. So that workers in each community know there is an independent institution of workers which can support us. And the second point is, it might be the moment to discuss about extension mechanism of collective bargaining agreements. Or say, look, we have so many people who work, in particular in the private sector, not currently covered. How can we generate systems that it becomes compulsory? And that's also the final point I want to make on the social security system. I mean, we know this from all countries. Employers don't like to pay into social security systems. They can avoid it, they don't do it. This is a governance question of the state. If you want to have a social security system, it's compulsory solidarity, it has to be enforced on everybody. I think that's key. I have a lot of other points, but I think we have a second round of discussion, and I saw, and I apologize that I took so much time in the first presentation, so I stopped here.
Evet, katılımcılarımıza ve konuşmacılarımıza teşekkür ederiz. ufak bir hatırlatma yapıp kahve arasına geçelim. Dosyalarınızda bir anket bulunmaktadır. Lütfen onu doldurun bir ara ve toplantı bitmeden önce masaya teslim edin. Teşekkürler. Buyurun kahve aranız.
Επειδή έχουμε ξεπεράσει τα χρονικά μας περιθώρια, παρακαλώ να ξεκινήσουμε. Θα παρακαλέσω τους συναδέλφους που θα παρουσιάσουν θέμα στο επόμενο κομμάτι της επόμενης συνάντησης να είναι όσο μπορούν πιο συνολικοί για να μπορέσουμε να είμαστε τόσο χρόνο και θα το κατευθύνω φίλων από το άλλο έναν Hoffer για να παρουσιάσει πολλές βεβαίως τον παρουσιάσει.
Yeah, thank you very much, and I'll try to be a bit shorter because I think we have covered some of the issues already in the earlier presentation. What I want to discuss as the main points is if you talk about the protection of wages, I think there are two levels. One is basically that if you want to protect wages, you need to have the right wage setting institutions in the country, that you get good wage agreements in the first place, and the second level, you need regulations that wages are then legally protected so that the agreed wages can also be enforced. Now, on the first point is that obviously the ILO is strongly arguing for the promotion of collective bargaining and also for the extension of collective bargaining. Key element for that is obviously two core ILO conventions, 87 98, freedom of association and right to collective bargaining. You know that in the ILO we do have a considerable battle for the last years. What Convention 87 includes and what it doesn't include. For a long time it was the common understanding that freedom of association includes the right of workers to withdraw their labor, to take strike action, because if you don't have that, you can't have collective bargaining, you can just have collective begging in a way, because you don't have any leverage and enforcement mechanism. And I think that remains the position of the government and also of the workers, obviously, that if you are serious about freedom of association, you must include the right to strike. The employers are challenging that, but I think there can be no question that if you don't have that possibility, the whole idea becomes meaningless. And that is also obviously always very often contested for the public sector. Now, the second point is that we have the ILO thinks also governments should not just ensure this rights, but they should promote collective bargaining. But whatever that means in detail, promote means some positive actions makes it easier for workers to organize and to increase the coverage of collective bargaining. The coverage of collective bargaining, the areas it's covering, and also the people it's covering. Now, this has been under major attack in the last years. You know this from the other international institutions. We had just this year's conference again reaffirmed, at least at the ILO, in the conclusions, that we think that also government should think about measures to extend collective bargaining coverage, and I come to that in a moment. The next level, obviously, of the wage-setting institutions is minimum wages. We have talked about this in the earlier session. I think that is a key component, in particular in countries where your collective bargaining system is not so comprehensive. In that case, you probably need this as a wage floor. What you have to avoid, what is a big challenge, is that you don't replace your collective bargaining system by just talking about minimum wages. I think you need a combination to say, first, unions need to be involved in the setting of minimum wages, and secondly, it should not, should always be understood as one element of wage setting, and you have to go beyond that and cannot just leave the rest of the wage setting to the market. The third point is that I think if you want to have wage setting institutions that protect wages, you need some sort of a social security system, or what economists would call, you need a reservation wage. I mean, if you look at the statistics globally, then in most developing countries, people are not unemployed, because the poor in these countries are just too poor to be unemployed. They work in the informal economy, they have to accept whatever kind of job is there. If you don't have some mechanism in place that if the market cannot provide a minimum income, then people must have the possibility to get a compensation through social insurance. We have proof even in a poor country like India, when they use the kind of rural employment guarantee scheme, where everybody has a right for 100 days of paid work, it had a major spillover effect of the wages even in the formal economy, because for the first time workers had a choice to say, the choice was no longer either I accept the worst condition offers or I starve, but either the working conditions are acceptable or I can go for the kind of publicly guaranteed at least period of working time. And I think for the more developed countries, clearly, if you don't have a social security system, it's very difficult to defend wages, and we can also see this, that always one of the attempts of the other side in trying to lower wages is that they want to break the social insurance system. Well, I've gone through this a bit already. The effect of collective bargaining clearly is not only that it protects the wages, it also creates, normally we know this, a more compressed wage structure. So the wages between the poor and the better paid workers are less. This is particularly important if you want to overcome also the gender gap in wages, because normally women are disproportionate in sectors, in industries with low wages. So if you have a more comprehensive collective bargaining system, we have evidence that in particular also low wages women are increased disproportionately high. Now, key, I think, for collective bargaining is if you want to avoid the kind of system of insiders and outsiders, then you have a coordination of collective bargaining and you have to high coverage. And that is, I think, where government policies come in. And I think the key point is also what changed in the last years is that we have no evidence, we have only ideological positions who say if you have collective bargaining systems which are more inclusive, comprehensive, it will produce unemployment. I mean, the OECD, not necessarily a framework of trade unions, has done research on that and came out that that there's no evidence that a more comprehensive collective bargaining system increase the cost of employment, and we have also increasing consensus that the collective bargaining system, the minimum wage systems, do not reduce employment. What we can see from empirical research is that if you have a more centralized collective bargaining system, then your inequality in society goes down and you have more inclusive societies. We can also see that collective bargaining is key for ensuring that the link between productivity growth and wage growth is maintained. You can see that in a country with higher collective bargaining coverage, we have seen in the last period from 1995 to 2007 that 1% economic growth resulted in a wage growth of 0.87%, and if you have no collective bargaining, the wage increase is 0.6%. 5%. So it's clearly that if you don't have a good collective bargaining system, growth is more unfairly shared, the wage share is declining faster. Now, the interesting thing is that sometimes things repeat itself, but you get different responses. When we had the deep crisis of the 20s, and we had then in the 30s attempts to solve this problem, economists were basically saying, like Keynes, but it was the same like the New Deal in the US and in other countries, that I regard the growth of wage bargaining as essential. I approve minimum wages and hours regulations. So there was a strong feeling that if you want to get out of this depression, where basically there's this unlimited power of employers to lower standards, you have to have a countervailing force, and that is the extension and universal application of collective bargaining. That's actually what's happened. We see in a lot of countries in the 30s. And unfortunately, we have seen a totally different response in this crisis, where we have seen, I mean, you all know this, the attack on more comprehensive collective bargaining systems. This is not a question of good economics. Full stop. It's not a question of good economics. It's a question of economic power. It's a question of distribution of power. And it might be that some people also believe what they're saying, but we have no evidence. We have no evidence that those countries who have decentralized their bargaining setting have actually become more successful in the crisis than others. And it's quite interesting that some of the countries who are preaching to others that they should decentralize their bargaining system have used massively in the crisis state subsidies, employment policies, social insurance systems to stabilize wages and to avoid that you go through a purely market-driven solution. Now, this is just, the ILO obviously has set quite a number of standards in building the collective bargaining systems. And I mentioned already 87, 98, there are a few more which are more extensive about what it means to promote collective bargaining, and obviously also the latest recommendation on the employment relationship tries to address the attempt by employers to circumvent labor protection just by defining workers as non-workers, contract workers, or disguise or agency work and so on. And we provide at least some guidance. Our governments should make sure that workers have access to the rights that they do. Well, minimum wages I already talked about, and what we think is the level and also the concept of minimum wage should have. I mean, the key elements of the minimum wage convention, I think, is that first, we're not saying there's one perfect solution for it, but governments, and I think Cyprus has ratified the convention, should have a system of minimum wages which covers all movement workers who are needed in this. There should be full consultation with the social partners. Then there comes an interesting point. We're saying we need to take into account the need of workers and their families, we all agree on that, and economic factors in terms of the level of minimum wages. But we are arguing not that there is a trade-off. The higher the minimum wage, the more negative the economic impact on employment impact. What we are arguing is that very often this can go in the same direction, because an increase of minimum wages can have positive impact on enterprise restructuring and modernization, and it can also have a very positive impact on aggregate demand in society. If there's aggregate demand, enterprises feel they can sell things, and if they can sell things, they will invest. I already talked earlier about the periodic investment and adjustment, and also about measures to ensure effective application of all provisions. Effective applications means on the one hand you have to have a labor inspection which can enforce this, and on the other hand that workers have recourse to free or affordable legal mechanism to demand minimum wage. Well, if you see the economic factors, we have looked what is the level of minimum wages here. We've seen, so you can see that on average most countries have a level of 35 to 45% of the average of the mean wage, which is basically the average wage, and 60% of the median wage. The median wage is what the 50th person among hundreds is earning. So we prefer actually the median wage because sometimes you can have a high average wage because if Bill Gates would come into this room, the average wage would go up heavily, but none of us would have any more. So therefore, with the median, you better capture what is the real situation. Single or multiple minimum wages, I think we have discussed this already in the morning session, that there are pluses and minuses of that. Social security, I already mentioned that what I think that this is key if you want to protect wages. Now let me come to the more kind of legal protection of wages. There's an ILO Protection of Wages Convention 95. I won't go into this very much, but because I saw in the PowerPoint presentation that a lot of the things which are in that convention are translated in law in Cyprus. I think the key element is here basically that you get regular wages, that is protected against insolvency and so on. Now, the second one is the protection of wages, employers, insolvency, Convention 173. This came later, and the most important innovation is that there should be a guaranteed institution, so that if the company goes bankrupt and workers still have to get wages and there is nothing, they would not even get wages if their demands are priority demands. So that there should be some sort of a joint fund of employers to protect wage claims. I think that is a key point. Whatever will be the effects of your unification process, there might be a higher risk of companies going bankrupt, and to make sure that people at least get their wages. And I think there are two other elements you have to think about. There are deferred wages, which are company-based pensions, where you have to think about how they can protect it, or increasingly also people who have working time accounts. So when people are saying, look, you're doing a lot of overtime and you might get it back later, so because of bankruptcy, that's basically deferred wages that they need to be protected. Now, another point I want to raise is the form of protection of the wages systems Convention 94, which is also ratified by Cyprus, which basically says that any public contract and public procurement, the state should ensure that any person they're buying services from, be it in construction or whatever, should pay at least the minimum wage or the prevailing collective bargaining wage. We had a bit of a discussion in the break. There might be a point to extend this in the discussion a bit also for certain state subsidies. So, for example, if you talk about domestic workers, where we had in the break we had a bit of discussion where the state is basically subsidizing households to employ domestic workers for care purposes. You could say this is equivalent to a state procuring other services. And then the state should demand that if we give this subsidy, at least certain employment standards for domestic workers should be respected. And they're trying to apply the same philosophy, which is in Convention 94. And then I think a key element which we see in very often is that workers do not have access to legal recourse. Or trade unions are offering it to their members, but then if there's a lot of demand, it becomes highly costly, the union is difficult to provide. The first step is to make sure that trade unions have the right to represent their members in court. I don't know whether that's the case in Cyprus, but that you don't have necessarily to have a lawyer, but that as a trade unionist you can represent. Secondly, a key element would be that trade unions can take employers to court and prevent full collective bargaining. In a lot of countries, a worker can go to court if there's collective bargaining agreement, but the union can't do it. It would change the balance of power massively. The union could say, we know this employer is not fulfilling its obligation, we take it and pay our members, because you take away also the fear and the burden from the individual worker. Because if the individual worker has to take the employer to court, it is a high risk. And also, but if the unionist organization can do it, then also you have to put limits on the costs of labor. And there's some countries, and we put, for example, also in the recommendation 202 on social security, that the poor people must have access to legal remedy free of charge. For example, if you are a poor person, you have a right to a basic pension, you don't get the pension. But if you say, look, you first have to go to court and it costs you a couple of €1,000, it means they can never do it. So that you ensure that the legal system on these issues is available. And then the final point I mentioned a bit in the morning already is the question of free access to legal advice. I mean, there's some systems like in Austria, for example, they have set up already in the 20s, I think, this kind of chambers of labor, which I know a lot of trade unions are very skeptical about this. I'll nonetheless want to introduce for your deliberation that idea that you basically say there's a levy on all workers, which goes to a chamber of labor which does not collective bargaining, it's not a union, but it provides services to workers, like legal services or research and so on. You could have grown research. But then these chambers are democratically governed by workers. So unions basically are like this also, and they put forward the people who are running these institutions. The advantage of that is that you get all the small and very small enterprises somewhat, which is very difficult to organize as a union, and that you have resources really to say, look, workers know there's a place in the community where they can go and where they can get this support. The key thing is, as a trade union, you need, right at the beginning, you need part of the governance structure, so that it cannot be used as a parallel structure against a union. But I think given the low organization rate in a lot of countries, I think we need to think about ways how we can increase the legal access. So I rushed them through. I think it was a bit better on time than the first session. Thanks for your attention.